Hey everyone, and thanks for taking the time to check out this video. For today's presentation, you guessed it, we are still talking about the SKS pattern carbine recovered at the scene of the September 15th incident in Florida. I wasn't planning to make another video on this subject quite so soon, and I do plan to keep this one brief, but a subscriber of mine just sent me a photograph that I know more than a few of you will be interested to see. So let's cut to the chase. This is the same photograph we've been looking at for the past few days, but it's been enhanced by a guy who goes by the name of Warsaw Patriot. Sincere thanks to him, by the way, for sending it to me. And as you can tell, it's still not a great image, but it's much clearer than what we've been working with, so let's break down the visible takeaways. First up, if anyone had any lingering doubts about this being an SKS pattern carbine, those should be erased at this time. In addition to being able to see the gas system clear as day, we can also now make out the distinctive sling attachment point integrated into the gas block, a characteristic feature of SKS pattern carbines. Perhaps more importantly, we can now clearly see that the stock and forend are monolithic, and although furniture itself is not an immutable characteristic, the way that furniture interfaces with a firearm often is. Had this been a partially converted Sega, as many people are still claiming, we would see a visual interruption in color and texture where the composite stock interfaced with a forged trunnion riveted into stamped steel. Instead, we see a drop-in style stock, which just so happens to bear a striking resemblance to one of the most popular aftermarket SKS stocks, the ATI Monte Carlo. Finally, we can now see a pretty clear metallic reflection forward of the point where the magazine interfaces with the weapon, which is very strong evidence that this is an aftermarket duckbill magazine. So for those who are wondering if this was a Chinese commercial SKS-D, I think that was very reasonable speculation, but it does not appear to be the case. And now, having seen this picture for myself, I'm actually increasingly confident in my prediction from yesterday that this will ultimately prove to be a Chinese Type 56 carbine manufactured at State Arsenal 296 between 1956 and 1969, but most likely in the early to mid 1960s. And if you're curious why I think that, just go ahead and check out yesterday's video. All of that's old news though, so let's get to the good part. This picture gives us some insight into something I've been extremely curious about, which is how the scope was attached to the receiver. As we've discussed previously, the vast majority of SKS pattern carbines in circulation were produced with no optic mounting provisions whatsoever, which means that scopes are typically attached using any number of aftermarket or craft modifications, the majority of which are generally compromised. And in this case, it does appear to me that our would-be shooter was in fact using one of the more compromised mounting solutions, which is actually far more commonly seen in the Middle East and North Africa than it is in the United States. I'll come back to that in a moment. Upon close inspection, what I see is two distinct bands wrapping around the optic and receiver of the firearm. Now, I'm a little confused here because the way the light is reflecting off this area looks metallic to me, almost like a ground weld. However, that may be an artifact of the photo enhancement. Regardless of the material used, however, in terms of the mechanical principles involved, it sure appears to me as though the scope is compression bound using two straps. And listen, as someone who spent the last 12 or so years studying the appearance of SKS pattern carbines in low intensity conflicts, this is fascinating to me because this is exactly what we see in the Middle East and North Africa region to this day. For those who aren't aware, the 45-second history of the SKS pattern carbine is that it was a military weapon designed immediately before a veritable renaissance in small arms design, and consequently it fell into obsolescence before it even entered mass production. Through a strange twist of fate, however, it found new life as it proved to have an exceptionally useful combination of traits for guerrilla armies and non-state actors. Most prominently, it became the de facto workhorse of the early People's Liberation Army, which subscribed to an unconventional doctrine of Maoist warfare. For my American and Anzac audience, our countrymen got a taste of exactly how that weapon synthesized with that doctrine during the Vietnam War, as the Viet Cong forces in particular heavily relied on the SKS and Mao's People War doctrine. Of course, by the 21st century, almost everyone has moved on from the SKS, even the Chinese moved on in 1980. However, it still appears fairly regularly in the Middle East and North Africa, Syria in particular, and here it continues to be used in exactly the same way that it's been used for generations. That said, even Syrian rebels fighting street to street and house to house understand that electro-optical aiming devices are an enormous force multiplier, and even if those optics don't hold zero very well, single aiming point solutions with illuminated reticles are often more valuable in real-world combat than a true zero is. I know it's a controversial opinion in some online gun circles, but as far as I'm concerned, either you've tried to use iron sights in the dark when you're starving and hallucinating and shaking from exhaustion, or you haven't done that. But if you have done that, you understand the true value of optics. I'll resist the urge to go too far down that rabbit hole today, but if you are interested in learning more about the historic and contemporary use of SKS pattern carbines in conflict, check out my SKS playlist. It will appear on your screen at the end of this video. To wrap up, however, today, as an SKS themed channel, I take a dark sense of pride in what this picture reveals. Based on what I understand about this story, the individual in question unlawfully acquired this weapon on the black market. He probably didn't have a lot of options, and this may well have been the best available to him. And for better, for worse, for right or wrong, that's exactly what the SKS has always been used for. And recently, this is more or less exactly how those SKSs have been configured. The SKS has always been a weapon for poorly trained guerrillas operating on limited resources. Sometimes they're heroic, sometimes they're cowardly, more often somewhere in between, but they're always in the line of fire, and they're always on the furthest fringes of civilization. This may not be the type of SKS that many of us find interesting to collect. It's certainly not what I find interesting to collect, but conceptually, this is a very good embodiment of exactly what the SKS has always been. And at the end of the day, that's really what my channel's about. I'm very interested in politics in my personal life, but when that red light starts blinking, pretty much all I'm interested in doing is my absolute best to tell the truth about firearms, the SKS in particular. And that's it for today, guys. As always, I hope this video was informative, entertaining, or at least worth the time you spent watching it. If you do like this type of content where we talk about the history and essence of these weapons, in addition to shooting them, don't forget to do the YouTube algorithm stuff, like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks again for stopping by. Hope you have a great rest of your day.